I am so excited to have you all here with me tonight. I am super excited and honored to have these beautiful people to my left join me today to share their words and their brilliance. So Groundswell, we're a social justice youth development program that uses the transformative power of public art to help bring about social and personal change in our young people. We have about over 500 murals that we have produced over the last 22 years. And I want to give a shout out. Where's Miss Thing? There she go. I want to give a shout out to Amy Sandman, who's our founder, who is here and joining us today. Amy, could you stand up, please? For having the dream and having the vision and having us here tonight. And there are so many people to thank, and we'll do that later. So we're going to have a conversation, and then the cherry on top, we're going to share with you who our core is. We're going to share with you why we're here, and we're going to have our young people come up. So we're really excited. We're going to end it where it is, with the beginning, middle, and end, which is them. And they're going to come up and share some of their work that they have in progress this summer. So we're really excited. So, y'all ready? All right, let's go. All right. So first I have with me, Justin Garrett Moore. Justin is an urban designer and executive director of the New York Public Design Commission. He has extensive experience in urban design and city planning, from large-scale urban systems, policies, projects to grassroots community-focused planning and design. At the Public Design Commission, his work is focused on prioritizing the quality and excellence of the public realm and fostering accessibility, diversity, and inclusion in the city's public buildings, spaces, and art. Thank you, Justin, for joining us. And next up, in the beautiful orange, we have Kwebe Koti. Kwebe is the founder and director of two Brooklyn-based organizations, Media, Culture, and Communications Group and Bushwick Film Festival. She's also the executive director at Open, which is, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. This is one of the reasons why we're going to get all of that in here, which is ODA's Public Engagement in Neighborhoods. It's a nonprofit foundation that funds community, green space, media and technology, architecture and design, and public art projects in underserved areas. She's passionate about community and the arts. She is a member of the Bushwick Community Board, serving on the Arts and Culture Committee and the Housing and Land Use Committee. She was born in Liberia, and her family immigrated to the U.S. at the brink of the Liberian Civil War. And we're so excited to have you here. Thank you, Kwebe. And we have Emma Osori. Emma is a social architect who builds systems that develop young people in given social, economic, and environmental realities. She is currently the Arts and Business Council of New York Program Manager, and she manages the internship program focused on equity in the New York City's arts management pipeline and training artists, arts nonprofits to build capacity. Her drive for developing more resourceful, creative young people comes from her own background growing up working class and finding the systems of poor people have always been pretty damn innovative. I love that. That's why I wanted to add that. Thank you, Emma. And last but certainly not least, we are honored to have Dred Scott with us tonight. Dred makes revolutionary art to propel history forward. I know, I had to meditate on that when I first heard it. He first received national attention in 1989 when his art became the center of controversy over its transgressive use of the American flag while he was a student at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. President George H.W. Bush called his art disgraceful. Congratulations. I know you made really good proud on that. And the entire U.S. Senate denounced his work and outlawed it when they passed legislation to protect the flag. Wow. His work has been included in recent exhibitions at the MoMA PS1, the Walker Art Center, the Brooklyn Museum, just all over. He's a recipient of the 2018 United States Artist Fellowship and grants from the Creative Capital Foundation. He works in a range of media, including performance, photography, installation, screen printing, and video. His works can be hard-edged and poignant. He plays with fire, metaphorically and sometimes literally, when he burned $171 on Wall Street and encouraged those with money to burn theirs. Yeah. Thank you, so we had a conversation before this conversation, just to prepare for you all tonight, and I'm going to just start off, cut straight to the chase. We're a panel of Black people up here this evening. Oh, y'all didn't notice that, and y'all see everybody up here with Black tonight. Yes. And so one of the things we're talking about gentrification, and we're talking about, these issues of community redevelopment, all the words that we use, and people say, well, these, who can really be indigenous to anything, right? People moving in and out. But then, you have the great idea, like, let's talk about how did Black communities even become Black? Like, how did that even happen?
Yeah, I think a lot of times in these conversations, everyone is in their kind of crisis moment, like what's happening now and today. And there's an important work of kind of going back to really understand how we got here, right? So we can't start the conversation from the middle. So going back, there are just so many deep layers of kind of how these communities came to exist in the first place, right? Dred was saying, like, we were brought here, right? There's a kind of a whole global project of displacement that is really the starting point of many of these communities. And then by law, by force, by violence, there have been all of these kind of spatializations of people in Black communities, right? And that's connected to labor, it's connected to extraction, it's connected to natural resource. And that's something that is kind of a responsibility of this kind of national narrative and national project that creates Black communities, right? Kind of the narrative of, the white woman liberty, progress, manifest destiny. There's another kind of side to that, which is kind of the destiny that was determined that people would be assigned to place, right? And those places were often places of labor, places of kind of environmental extraction or concern. And ultimately, it was kind of a social project around a valuing of people and a valuing of bodies, right? And so that valuing or devaluing of people and bodies has a geography, right? So we have zoning and kind of codes around where people could live, and where people could work, how people could act, how people could move. That became the framework, the foundation of these communities. Redlining, so many different kind of, contract laws and things that were put into place that created this environment. So our communities, Black communities, have been kind of operating in that space, but it's still our space, right? Out of necessity, out of kind of innovation, out of pain, out of joy, there is an incredible value to these places that needs to be recognized.
Thank you. Kwebe, you do some really interesting work in terms of community engagement with developers. Can you talk a little bit about, what is that interaction like, and the work that you're doing to help communities in some ways kind of get some kind of benefit out of these relationships?
Yeah, of course. I started out as a community organization called the Bushwick Film Festival. That was my first organization. I ran that for I'm still running it. We're going into our 11th year. And I think somewhere around year 5 or 6 in Bushwick, we were, struggling to figure out funding and the next steps. And I was just like, what are we going to do here? We're not a nonprofit, so we can't get discretionary funding from city council members. It was just, there's a lot of organizations that are in the same situation that I'm in. So how am I going to find a creative way to keep my organization afloat? So I just, in the neighborhood in Bushwick particularly, and I'm sure across all of Brooklyn and New York City, you see what's happening at the moment is just a lot of development. Development's everywhere. So I was like, where is the money in the neighborhood? So it's with development. So I actually approached the developer and I asked them, I said, hey, my name is Kwebe, I run the Bushwick Film Festival. I think you should really consider earmarking a certain percentage of your funding towards arts and cultural organizations in the neighborhood or towards the community. You know, like whatever you're spending here, put aside like 20% if you can. Probably not that much, but like put aside a small percentage. And that was just, you know, a shot out of the dark. And the first developer I approached, they were like, "Oh, okay, that's interesting. Let's do this." And I was like, "Oh, okay." So they ended up supporting the festival, but then I took it a step further, and I was like, this is interesting. Maybe I could approach more developers and convince them to not support the festival only, but to convince them to think about putting aside a certain percentage of their finances towards building the community, and not necessarily just bringing apartments that are unaffordable, but also how can they put their money into organizations that have been in the neighborhood for decades doing good work, etc. So I started working with them, and I built a few programs for them to better engage with the neighborhoods that they are building in. So it goes from, you know, I've built some programs that were basically funding artists or funding cultural organizations or funding community organizations that needed extra services or spaces and things like that. So I sort of morphed into like this liaison between community and developers, which is a very uncomfortable place to be.
What have you dealt with in being that kind of middle person? Like, what has it been like for you?
Well, I mean, to be honest, the hardest part for me was first being on the working with developers was very hard, but also my community looking at me like I was a sellout, you know, like selling out my community, or, you know, a black gentrifier. You know, I've been called that, and it's been complicated and difficult because I know that at the end of the day I could say, all right, in 2016, we put set aside $250,000 worth of funding for X, Y, and Z. You know, so it's sort of like it's hard because I come from very like a poor family, and you know my mother and my family struggled all their lives. So I know my heart and my intentions are in the right place, but the hardest part is to try to convince the community that what I'm doing is the right thing to do. But it's been an interesting journey, and we've done a lot of great work, but there's definitely a long, long way to go.
And Emma, I'm excited to have you, and both you and Justin, share more about Black Space, which I love. You know, you were working in terms of like cultural like preservation in communities, and there was this really great quote that I kind of pulled from an article that you contributed to, and you talked about. I just wanted you if you could just unpack it a little bit. You were like, we try to speak truth to power, but we also want to make our own things. So can you share a little bit more about like what do you mean by that?
Sure. So in Black Space, we're a group of about 25 urbanists, Black urbanists. So we work across various design and arts and economic development professions. And we work on two planes. So one is pushing each other towards professional excellence, and the other is working in historically Black neighborhoods, right now in New York, but we also have chapters in 2 other cities. Maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that. And so what we found, we're a very sort of emergent group, and what we found over our history and work is that half of what we're doing is talking to professionals like us. Often we're the only ones in our offices, only Black people, only people who are thinking, or one of the few people who are thinking about social justice and design professions. And so how do we craft the language and shift the narratives in our own professions to be able to push the needle on equity and justice in Black neighborhoods or amongst Black people? And obviously, when you, well, not obviously, but you know, when you're opening things for any marginalized community, we know that it makes it better for everybody, which is ultimately all of our underlying goals. So what I meant when I said we speak truth to power is that a whole big portion of our group's work is talking to people who work at our jobs and who are in our professions. And we sit on panels like this, we talk to you. We are always, I think Justin is booked through like 2019. Like just making sure making sure that we're talking about the importance of Black communities and helping people engage in ways that are fruitful and more just and more equitable. And then that work, like that's already a lot of work because we're choosing to teach, right, and choosing to learn. But then we also make things, right? We want to, as the Black space is a space where we can come together as professionals and sort of craft and ideate and create these projects that we can't necessarily do as quickly at work. And so we really enjoy unlearning a lot of our teachings about how to work in communities, and so we support each other in that process. But then after that unlearning, we're learning together about what does a bigger future look like? What is a just city? What is equitable development? And these are things people ask us all the time, and we're just like, we don't know, we're still figuring it out. But like together, right? And we come from all these different disciplines, and so it is really a joy and a unique situation where you have these cross-disciplinary thinkers, leaders, lovers, activists working together to create the future that we imagine for ourselves and also for our communities and the places we come from and we inhabit.
Thank you. Me back in. Do marginalized people, like, do we really have the power to like radically reimagine our neighborhoods? Like, do we? Is it possible?
Well, I mean, yes, but I mean, I do think that people have the power to imagine, and in fact, I think that to the degree people are looking at just what's right in front of us in the narrowest sense, it's actually a real problem in a lot of things, including in terms of political vision. But I say make revolutionary art to propel history forward. I actually think that capitalism is a disaster for humanity, and the American flavor of it is just a tremendous tragedy. This is a country that was founded on slavery and genocide, and it's based on exploitation and oppression to this day. And so, there are, it's possible to make some changes, but I mean, as we were talking, talking a little bit earlier, it's like, what's driving a lot of the sort of city planning and urban planning right now, and what gets built, including specifically for housing, is developers. Their interest, I mean, I'm glad that you approach a developer and say, well, okay, let's take care of the artist, but it's like, that is we can make some changes like that, and it's good, but I think that actually covers, I mean, I'm not saying you're covering over or apologizing for, but if that success actually sort of or distracts us from the fact that the main thing that's happening is people's lives are being ground up. Mm-hmm. And so I think we can imagine city, but if we're trying to actually make this work, I think that's actually the problem. The horizon needs to be, how can we get to a world we actually want to live in, that doesn't actually treat, say, housing and people as commodities, the necessities of life, food and housing, as actual commodities to make other people rich, and if you can't make them rich and enrich them, then they don't get built. And we're actually witnessing a lot of that in New York right now. The housing stock that's being built is for is for much wealthier people than probably are in this room, when there's tremendous need for people that actually just need basic shelter. And so, I think people should envision and fight in a certain sense on these local things. And I think as Cueva said, you can actually make some change, but if that's the where we're really focusing at, what can we do with our neighborhood? We don't own these neighborhoods, and we never will. And we actually need to set our sights on the whole world.
So again, I think there's a feeling sometimes in terms of the development of the city that this train has like left the station, right? So either you getting on the train or you gonna get run over, right? So Justin, like, there are like some people that get planned for, right? And then there are some people that get planned on, right? You're planned on top of all these things. So what are the strategies that historically marginalized communities can use to really not always be on that other end of being planned on and on top of?
So yeah, it's a huge problem, and it's been a pattern, right? And I think some of the work that we've been doing at Black Space is talking about kind of who is doing this work, right? So we're all in these different professions, the kind of the built environment professions, the city making professions, whatever you want to call it, and very often the tables that we're at, we're the only one, right? The rest of the table is going to be predominantly white, predominantly male, predominantly upper income, if not wealthy, right? So that's who's making the decisions. That's what's happening. And so the work that we're trying to do is to talk about how do we change that dynamic, right? So there are a lot of different layers to it. There's a huge knowledge gap, right? I always tell people I went to architecture design planning school for 7 years, including an Ivy League education, and we never learned about anything Black people did. Right? It's a problem, right? So the canon, like everything that people in those fields are taught how you do things, is rooted in, be frank, white supremacy, right? Corbusier's like the man, right? And so that's a problem, right? So there's this kind of project about kind of learning, and to Emma's point, kind of unlearning some things about what we need to know about how to develop. So that's one kind of piece is kind of pushing that agenda of a project for how do we learn how to do things. Connected to that is kind of the community awareness and knowledge building. Communities changing, we talk about what do people know and what do they not know, right? And that being an honest conversation is something that's really important. Worked in the planning department for several years, and when we would go into different communities around development plans, you go to Brooklyn Heights or Carroll Gardens, you have the Wednesday night community meeting, a lot of people show up and half of them are attorneys, right? You go to kind of a lower income, predominantly minority community, you go on a Wednesday night meeting, everybody's at work or they have to take care of their kids, there's a few grandmas there. I mean, that's the reality, right? And our government and our system is kind of churning through that. And so there's this project about how do you refashion and remake kind of how that process even works. And I think the city has been trying to do that in a better way than in past years, but there's still absolutely a long way to go to kind of level that playing field. And the final piece, and it's to Dred's point of like kind of the ownership model, I mean, ultimately in the system that we're all operating in, ownership is a huge piece, and so how you kind of have other models for how that happens is something that I know a lot of people are really working on, how to get around that or provide ways for actual ownership, or at least decision-making ownership in how places change.
Anyone else have any thoughts about like how historically marginalized communities cannot just be kind of like planned on, but can really have a seat at the table?
Well, I think I agree with the ownership part. I mean, when I was growing up, I grew up in Newark, in Newark, New Jersey, and I just don't remember ever thinking or knowing or even caring who owned anywhere. like I was just, I never crossed my mind like who owned my building or all the buildings that I've rented my entire life. But when just recently, like getting a little bit older and understanding the process of gentrification and also even working with developers, now it's just all the knowledge that I'm getting just out of the process of being on that table, the only woman of color, not upper class. It's just, it's just an interesting learning experience, and I personally do wish and hope that we as people of color or underrepresented communities engage a little, or not engage a little bit more, but try to understand ownership and development and how it all works, and the community board meetings and your city council members, like all that. Like I go to community board meetings literally every month. I go to 5 meetings here. A member of the community board is here too. But I wasn't doing those things in the past. And I probably wouldn't be doing it if I wasn't trying to figure out how to make my arts organization survive. So yeah, I think that would be a step in the right direction, understanding land ownership in New York, you know.
So Emma, like, what is like one of the most important things? Like, what's the first step that we should be doing? Like, what's something like really tangible that everyone should really get involved in immediately?
I would advocate for getting involved with young people. I think that sort of what I was going to say in relation to the other question is that a lot of my work is in helping to raise young people, undergraduates, to be successful inside arts institutions in New York City, but also help to shift the narrative, right? Look for places where within the institution you can start to make little dents. And so, or build your own, obviously, that's another great solution.
Yeah.
But I think, but I think working with young people is a really great way to start introducing yourself and your world and your worldview to people who are coming up and are curious and want to know how to do things and want to earn money. I think there are many ways to get involved, and I'm sure everybody in their neighborhood has somewhere where they can think of right now that they can probably go and ask, like, how do I get involved with young people? Groundswell is a great place also to do that. And so how do you pay it forward to young people? That's a really great way to start.
Right, that's a really important. The intergenerational point is really, really key to this work.
So Dred, there are people who say that artists are tools of displacement. When the artists move into your neighborhood, like, know that your neighborhood's about to change, right?
Yeah.
So, so what is your response to that? And like, and how does your artwork like inspire revolution and promote historical memory, right? But also, could you just answer both of those things?
I mean,
Well,
when they see artists moving into a neighborhood, is they should like beat a couple of them up really badly. You don't want to kill them. So that they heard, no, don't go there, it ain't safe. And then the people with real money ain't gonna come and like displace the artist.
That's a mess.
I mean, it's like I'm gentrifying my sixth neighborhood now. I mean, I gentrified 2 neighborhoods through having studios and 4 neighborhoods through living in them. And and everywhere I go, I go because hey, I can afford it. And it's got it's close to a train, or it's got something that's a little bit nice, but I can afford it. It's the main thing. It's not like there weren't people there that were existing. It's not like I was Columbus. Hey, wow, there's but it's like I get there and it's like everything's all chill. And then the artists like happen to live. We don't get eaten by lions, and people are like, oh man, I gotta go live by some artists. Yeah, we should develop this. We should bring some restaurants and stuff like that. And so suddenly restaurants start coming, and Pilates gym, and Starbucks, and all that stuff. And then it's like the artist, oh, you've done your job, go. You gotta go. And so but it's not, it's not the artist's fault, but we are the canaries in the coal mine. If you want to see gentrification, literally just follow artists, at least in big cities. I don't know how it works in really small towns, but I don't know any neighborhood that hasn't been gentrified with artists being the spear point that have done that. And the thing is, it's like the artists are somewhat unwitting pawns in this. It's not like we go in and like make an alliance with the developers and say like, all right, we're going to go clear out all these poor people and make the neighborhood hip, and you're going to like give us a couple blocks and we can own that, and then set up artist studios and museums. That ain't the game. The game is like you go in, you live someplace cheap. It's like, oh yeah, we'll let you live in this place, and then once we've used you, you got to go. And as far as what people should do, I don't really have I don't have a plan. I don't claim to know how to stop that within this system. My big thing is this system is actually the problem. We need revolution, and that my art does that through hopefully having people engage some of the big questions confronting humanity. And in terms of visioning, like right now I'm working on a project called Slave Rebellion Reenactment.
Yeah.
Which is going to reenact the largest rebellion of enslaved people in North American history. That rebellion happened in 1811 outside of New Orleans, and the part of why I'm really interested in this particular rebellion was it wasn't just like let's kill some white people and get revenge before we get killed. It was actually a planned out thing for a year or more, where they wanted to seize all of Orleans Territory, which is modern-day Louisiana, and end slavery. It set up an African republic in the New World. It was the most radical vision of freedom on the North American continent at the time. And it was far more radical than, say, the U.S. Constitution, which is predicated upon owning human beings. The freedom embodied in that document is predicated upon owning human beings. It's not very radical. It's an outdated, outmoded document. Let's not, like, prop up the Constitution and talk about that democracy. And so these enslaved people were trying to get out from under the roots of that. And so I'm going to embody sort of with 500 people in period-specific costume, with machetes and muskets and cane knives. They're going to march in areas that were sugar plantation, that is now oil refineries, chemical production plants, gated communities, trailer parks. And it's for 26 miles. So it's going to be amazing. And that's going to pose questions for people to think about. I mean, the shadow of slavery is really long in America overall, but particularly in New Orleans, outside of New Orleans. And so people will see sort of an army of the enslaved, and that will pose questions about both, what did it take to end slavery? And very few people will get up and say, well, those slave rebels, man, they shouldn't have done that. They should have just formed a super PAC or voted. I don't want them to be all radical and shit. They're like, no, that's kind of cool. We get it. And so it'll pose questions for people to think about how change happens. And because, again, it was really systemic, because it would have been easy to just figure out, look, we could just endure slavery, or maybe a few of us could escape, or maybe a group of us could escape and form a maroon colony. But they said we needed to end the system of enslavement, and to do that, we have to figure out how to do that. We have to overthrow the system. And so, posing questions like that, or like, what is the role of the police, and how are they the successors of lynch mob terror? Right. Many people would say, well, damn, that's kind of bold, but actually I could break it down and make people engage that in ways that people can think, oh, well, if that's what the police are, maybe we got to rethink this, because we think, lynching and lynch mobs were really bad, so maybe we got to rethink what the role of the police is. Mm-hmm. And so that's, what I'm trying to do with my work, and is pose some really big questions and sort of shift the perspective of the conversation, including around who are the agents of change. I really like what you say, I'm paraphrasing or but this, basically poor people are really creative. I think, it's this whole thing of who gets to, just talk about the developers, well, it's basically rich white guys. Well, what happens if you go to a community and say, you go to Harlem 20 years ago, or even 15 years ago, and say, well, we're going to have a conversation about how Harlem's going to be developed. We're going to invite the people from grant houses to have an equal platform at the table with the lawyers. Then you have a whole different conversation.
Emma, can you speak a little bit about, because I did a little bit of reading, trying to prepare for this, and talking about the correlation between, I was like, city planning and social justice. What is the correlation between those two things? How do you plan a city, and how do you plan for justice?
So I think I made the disclaimer before, we don't know yet.
Right.
Working on it.
Well, you have some.
No, I think that it goes back to what Justin was saying earlier about there are very systematic ways that we have arrived at the cities we know today. And a lot of those tools that were used, those systems that were put in place, those laws, were really unequal, unjust, oppressive. And I think that as people in the design professions, people who are in groups or have a worldview similar to Black Space, it's thinking about how do we look at those very clear policies that, and practices that people in our professions, we're owning that. People in our professions did these things to lots of different communities, but poor communities, Black communities, ran highways through very intentionally. And how do we, now owning that in our professions, work to shift that? And so that is, you can't we can't move a highway in a day, and many in those communities are gone. But what can we do in the present day to both not preserve, but conserve some of the cultural richness that has been created as a result of some of those policies and laws? And then also, how do we together unlearn and then create these new ideas about what our neighborhood should be in our own image and viewpoint? Or how do we really facilitate that? It's not that we're going in and saying, reimagine your whole community, but how do we help people ask good questions about their neighborhoods so that, and feel like they have the tools and resources and networks to be able to make change. And so I think city planning has a long history of inequality, and so that in our professions there are some very clear ways and clear things we can point to say, yeah, this was really bad. How do we make sure this doesn't happen in the future, but also how do we sort of reconcile some of the things that have happened in the past?
And power dynamic is something that's absolutely legally connected to city planning. So 10th Amendment gives the power to the state to do whatever they want, basically for the benefit of health, safety, welfare, and morals, right? So the same laws that allow the police to, like, you know, kill people are the same laws that allow the city to say, we can't build a certain type of housing in this neighborhood, right? The same legal framework is behind both of those things, but I think an important conversation for how we shift narratives and think a different way is how are we defining and articulating what's healthy, what's safe, what's moral, because that kind of definition has been defined by a very limited number of people in our society. But being able to kind of reframe that and have a different conversation, so that's where the creativity, what do we mean by I feel safe, right? What do we mean by this is a healthy place? And that has ramifications on everything from what does our police force look like and how do they behave to how does my street look, right? How is it used? And so those are really important kind of conversations that are about kind of, again, re-educating general population, but also the people that are invested in doing this work.
And I follow you in all forms of social media. I follow them all, but I follow Justin because you always have like a new like public project or some new development, and I always watch like, oh, like that's like I would go to that waterfront, or that's really cool. And I'm looking like who's there. I'm like, do I feel like should I go there? Right, which leads me to my question before we go into our presentation. Absolutely.
I just wanted to add, like, just, you know, Bushwick currently, since we're talking about like what neighbors can do, obviously is going through a bunch of rezoning. So what the community of Bushwick did, they got together and decided and worked for years to put together something called the Bushwick Community Plan to sort of set an action plan that developers can look at when they think about how they're going to develop in the neighborhood of Bushwick. But the interesting thing about that is obviously, you know, the plan is the plan. There's no legal, you know, binding. You know, if developers want to be good neighbors, they will look at the plan and say, okay, this is what the community wants, and this is how I'm going to develop. But a little bit about city planning is I'm working on a project right now in Bushwick, and it's a rezoning, right? And it's controversial or whatever, and the developer wanted to rezone like 8 city blocks, right? And so the community is protesting so they won't rezone any blocks, but they're like, why are you rezoning 8 blocks? Like, why can't you just rezone your development? And so the interesting thing that I learned in the process of going through all the city planning hearings is that city planning sound development is they don't like spot rezoning. So a spot rezoning is when you only rezone one, like your property in the block. So Bushwick, that block is manufacturing, is only zoned for manufacturing, and they're trying to rezone it into residential. So they're trying to rezone all of the blocks, all the lots to residential, and a lot of the lots are owned by like small mom and pop shops and like, you know, a restaurant, and so the moment that you rezone blocks into residential, they turn into soft sites, which means that a developer might come in and buy the site and redevelop it, you know? So that's the fear. And that's like for the fear for the future, you know, the landlord doesn't have to do anything, but if they're like, this is a soft site, like somebody might want to redevelop. So that's why people don't want it to be rezoned to residential. So anyway, the point of that conversation is that sound planning for city planning, they don't like spot developments. So that means that in order to push this application forward, they included all blocks. Now, the city council member has the power, and your city council members have the power too, in your zones, to actually say, I will take out the lot and sort of talk to city planning. So there's like so many different levels of how this all works that like it's just so confusing. And I would encourage people to really get involved on the community level, because you really understand like all the different, from block representations to your council member, what power he has, what the city planning power has, what the mayor has, and it's just like so many levels of craziness when it comes to development that like that's one example I wanted to offer, just to show how it all, so many hands in the pot.
No, thank you so much, Wei-Bei. So I have one question, and then we're going to go into some presentations from our panelists. So this idea of being Black and in public space, right? So what I was saying was just like, I'm always looking at all the great like projects that you're sharing, like, oh, we have this great new thing and it's great waterfront. I'm just like, are there Black people in there? Like, am I gonna be safe if I go to the space? Like, is somebody gonna call the police on me? Because we have like, you have like the barbecue betties and the permit patties and all these other kind of things. I mean, everybody, the coupon Kirk, like, I don't know. So like, let's talk about like being Black in public space. And because it seems like we're hearing about this because we know it happened anyway, but because of social media, we're hearing about it even more. Like there's, incidents of Black people being harassed for doing everyday like activities, right? So my question, and you can start with you, Dred, anyone can answer, is like, how can Black people enjoy public space? Like because of racism?
Well, I mean, first off, Black people do enjoy public space. It's like, I went for a bike ride, well, not this morning, yesterday morning. It's like, so I was in the park. So, in the main, we do enjoy a lot, and I think we should remember that. At the same time, all this is happening that everybody knows that for no reason whatsoever, that any person, and largely any white person, feels like, messing with you, they can call the cops. They can bring in armed people who may kill you. For no reason whatsoever. It could be just everything from regular humiliation to death. It's like, somebody called the cops on Tamir Rice. He died. Some cops just rolled up on Eric Gardner. He died. Sandra Bland, dead. So it's people do enjoy space, but there is this thing where there's a whole range of things that are just everyday activities that people are doing that, written in Airbnb. And somebody said, well, I didn't like those people in my neighborhood. Oh, people moving into, Henry Louis Gates, going into his own apartment. Cops come and he says, no, really, this is my house. I'm Henry Louis Gates, damn it. It's like, no, you're going to jail. You're breaking into your own house. And so but now it is really escalating with Trump. And I don't think it's just social media. I do think it's really escalating. Nobody, 3 years ago would have, recently we were just talking about the guy that was playing basketball, flagrant foul, and so the guy called the police. Wait, you're playing.
No, he called the police because he got fouled too hard.
Yeah. It's like nobody, so somebody was playing basketball. White guy's like, man, this big old African came up and laid down some Black Panther block on me, so I'm gonna have to call the cops. And it's like, but that's part of what's a whole, fascism that's growing, where, people are being dehumanized, and instead of the cops saying, you call this because somebody fouled you? Fuck you, we're not coming out, we're not wasting our time. Or when, somebody's asleep at a dorm in Yale that they go to and somebody calls, instead of saying, we don't have time for this bullshit, you say, all right, we gotta come humiliate and degrade and possibly kill somebody. And so that's actually, a situation that people have to be very attuned to, and I come back to, we actually need to fight this whole thing. And in particular, I think that means right now people need to work to drive out this Trump regime. Not say, oh yeah, we're gonna vote them out in 2018 or 2020. We actually need to be in the streets and topple this government and drive it from power. And that is, urgently needed. And, that's how we can, I would really enjoy that public space. I would enjoy the American Tahrir Square. If people occupied and sat in DC and said, we ain't going till he goes. And take, Pence with him and take, Sessions with him and take that whole regime with him. That would be a public space that would be amazing to be in. And that's how I think we should really think about enjoying public space.
Thank you. Anybody else wants to respond to that before we move on? I guess it's a mic drop.